My name is Faye Stenning and I'm a marketing manager here at InfoTrack. So I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, where we're going to recap on some recent changes to the conveyancing quality scheme, what's likely to come next, and also how to ensure CQS compliance through the technology available to support the journey through integration with Osprey and InfoTrack. So taking you through today's webinar, I'm delighted to be joined by Tracy Thompson, who's a lead assessor for CQS. Tracy is going to be joined by Dave Dingle, who's a product specialist and account manager at Osprey, and InfoTrack's Northern Sales Manager, Lisa Edwards. So just before we begin the webinar, I'd like to draw your attention, please, to the Q&A tab, which you'll see located at the bottom of your screen. We will be running a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. So if you do have any questions, please type them in for either Tracy, Lisa or Dave, along with your name into the Q&A box. And that way, if we run out of time or if your question requires further clarification, we can follow up with you directly after the webinar. So without further ado, I should like to hand you over to Tracy so that she can take you through today's webinar. Thanks, Tracy.
Okay, thanks, Faye. Good afternoon, everybody. If you haven't come across me before, my name's Tracy Thompson. I am a lawyer. I work with Lexel as a Lexel assessor and Lexel consultant. Have done for many years, and was appointed as lead assessor for CQS back in 2019. So I'm going to talk to you today about CQS, the updates that we've had, which you should now all be following in practice, and also letting you know a little bit about what's actually happened in terms of patterns and trends, which are apparent from the work and the reviews coming out of CQS practices, and also just to give you some information about what next and what you should be looking for this year with CQS. So just to move swiftly on. Okay, so hopefully you are all aware that there were some significant changes to CQS back in May 2022. So obviously we had the original round of changes, which came about in the middle of 2019, where we had updates to the core practice management standard. We also had updates to the conveyancing protocols in 2019. And of course, we also had an update for the code for completion by post. So subsequent to that, obviously we've had a few years of very, very busy times in practice and COVID, etc. And the Law Society are always working on CQS. It will always be a working document. There will always be improvements to the standard, the scheme rules, the core practice management standard. So every now and again, there will be an additional rollout and updates to the standard. So the last update that we saw was announced about this time last year. Law Society announced to CQS accredited practices that there will be further updates to the core practice management standard that will become compulsory for you to follow in practice from 1st of May 2022. So those are the requirements that you should be following in practice now, which I'm going to talk you through. But just as importantly, the Law Society also announced at that time that from 1st of May, there will be the formal launch of the on-site assessments, and practices needed to make sure that they are assessment ready from that date. And hopefully you are. And if you're not, then hopefully by the time you've listened to what I've got to say today, you might go back and review what it is that you need to be doing to make sure that you are able to demonstrate compliance with CQS. So those were the two changes that came into place in May last year, and I'll just talk you through them to let you know what it is that you should be doing. So in relation to the updates to the core practice management standard first. So we had the 2019 version, which was 34 requirements over 6 chapters. We had an increase in the 22 version. So that increased the core practice management standard requirements to 7 chapters and up to 40 individual requirements. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are an additional 6 requirements in the new standard. What it does mean that some of the requirements were split out. So we had the increase to 40 individual requirements, and then we also had this increase to 7 chapters. And that increase to 7 chapters brought into play people management, which was a section which didn't appear in the previous standard. So there were some changes, some significant changes in terms of reformatting. So the standard as it is at the moment, so the 2022 version of the core practice management standard is now very much aligned with Lexcel. So if you are a Lexcel accredited practice, it will be easier for you to be able to correspond between the two different standards and obviously identify where there is an overlap. There is a 50% overlap between Lexcel and CQS. So if you are a Lexcel accredited practice, then you should already be able to demonstrate compliance with 50% of the CQS core practice management standard in the residential conveyancing department, because that is something that you will be used to having an annual Lexcel assessment or annual maintenance visit to make sure that those things are in place and in practice. Obviously, the other 50%, which some of those requirements appear in some way in CQS, but not necessarily identically to Lexcel. So Lexcel accredited practices, you should be some way there. In terms of the reformatting, we had significant movement in terms of what was 6.1 is now 3.1, and various things like that. So we had some movement around the actual the standard itself, and as I say, we're now aligned with Lexcel. So some other things to note as well, there were updates to all the sections apart from section 1, which is structure and strategy, and section 2, which is financial management. There are some areas of the standard that might look different to you, and the reason for that is that some of the wording has been moved from the actual requirement into the guidance. So I'll give you an example here. 6.2, which is in client care section, and is a requirement for what you need to inform your client of at the outset in writing. You need to send your client care letter. In the old standard, we had a lot more detail. So in the old standard, in 2019 core practice management standard, there was more detail that you needed to confirm to your client in writing all of these things. So you needed to confirm the timescales, the name of the person who was dealing with the matter, their status, the supervisor, their status, etc., etc. So there was a lot of subsections in the old standard. Now here you will see in today's 2022 core practice management that some of that information has been stripped out, and actually what you're left with is you must confirm to your client in writing appropriate information that must include timescales or likely timescales and service levels. Okay, so it's a mistake to think that all of the other requirements have actually been taken away. And I did read something a few days ago actually that had actually been documented that shouldn't have been with another company that effectively said that these parts of the standard have now been removed. That's not the case at all. They've just been moved in terms of, it doesn't really sit in the specific requirement, but if you look at the guidance, then that is what sets out the minimum expectations for what the Law Society expect to see in practice. So nothing's been removed as such. What you do need to do is you need to make sure that you read the requirement of the core practice management standard and then read guidance notes that sit with it. And then that is what gives you context for what we expect to see when we're actually reviewing the practice and your documentation and your files. So again, similarly with information management security in the current standard, it basically says you need to have an information management security policy, but actually the detail is in the guidance, and that is where you will find all that information about having user accounts and all your technical requirements for firewalls, for software updates, and all that kind of thing. So it does still exist. It's just been set out in a different way. So that's really important to note. So I'm going to run you through some of the changes and just identify to you what changed specifically from May 2019 through to May 22. If there's been no changes, obviously I'm not going to reference those, but we did have a change whereby we had a new introduction, which is in relation to data protection. We need to make sure that we ensure that all personnel are kept aware of developments in cybercrime and how they might affect the practice. So you will see on my slides here that I've colour-coded the requirements. So if we see green, then that is identical. If we see amber, then there's a slight variation, but if we see red, this is completely new and did not appear in the 2019 core practice management standards. So that's really where you need to focus if you have already gone through an exercise back in 2019 of making sure that you had everything in place that you needed to have in place. So here, make sure that everybody is aware of cybercrime, how it affects the practice, and you're only as good as the people who click on the links. So that's something that you'll need to put into place, making sure that you have systems in place. You will see that there is a new requirement to have a register of each policy, plan and procedure that is contained within the core practice management standard. So this didn't appear at all in the old standard. Quite simply, a register identifying, who is responsible for each particular requirement. And then you need to make sure that you have a corresponding procedure for reviews. So, a procedure needs to set out the steps that you will take to achieve something. So your corresponding procedure just needs to be a paragraph somewhere that states that, this is our register, this is who's responsible for these policies, procedures and plans. And actually, on an annual basis, for example, on an annual basis, we will undertake a review of all the policies, procedures and plans contained within the core practice management standard, taking into account patterns and trends in the practice, data from our own records, updates to legislation, updates to regulation, updates to any quality management standard. This is who's going to be involved in it. This is how we will document it, etc. So that is what a procedure should look like. And do be mindful of the wording in the standard as well, because if it does state that you must have a procedure, then that does need to be written down and just need to set out those steps. Then we move on to people management. Like I say, this didn't appear in the old standard. Some of the requirements did appear somewhere else, but this is the new chapter. And within this new chapter, we had learning and development policy in the old standard, but we've got some additions to this particular requirement. So you need to have your learning and development policy. You need to make sure that you are giving consideration to giving appropriate training to personnel as appropriate to their role. And you also need to make sure that you are giving consideration to what training you're giving to supervisors and managers. So again, dependent on the role that somebody's doing in the practice, will depend on what training and what learning and development support they need. So that's new, so you will need to give consideration to that. And also, you need to have a procedure to evaluate training. So again, give consideration to what does that look like? If we do training, how do we evaluate it? Where do we record it? What is it that we're evaluating? What happens with that data going forward? So again, just think about the kind of the journey. So those are the requirements that are new in section 4.1. And then we have the totally new requirements for having documented induction. So this didn't appear in the old standard. So really important to note that, we have quite often induction procedures for when somebody joins the practice, but quite often what we overlook is when people are transferring roles within the practice. So CQS specifically requires you to give consideration to that. So think about, obviously, when somebody's promoted within the practice, but also think about trainees as well. So it may be that your trainees have done a seat in, the criminal department, they've done a seat in the family department, and then they're doing a seat in the residential conveyancing department, and their needs and their training requirements and key policies are likely to be very different to what they've been exposed to and what they needed in family or crime, for example. So it's important that you make sure that you give consideration to this, but also not just think about new starters, think about people transferring roles as well. So that's section 4, which is new. Section 5 is the I suppose the meatiest part of the standard. The standard itself runs from 5.1 through to would be 5.18, but there is actually duplication in the core practice management standard. So it's quite weighty. There's 18 different requirements in the risk management section. We've got, quite a minor amount of amendments within this particular section of the standard. So we had in the previous chapter 4, the learning and development requirements. Within that learning and development requirements, we've always had the need for practices to ensure that personnel are aware of the core practice management standards and how the practice complies, and also the protocols, the national conveyancing protocols. So that has always been in your learning and development policy requirements. What we do have as a new addition to this particular version is you need to have procedures in place to make sure that personnel are adhering to the protocols. So make sure that everybody is aware of them, and then obviously think about how you can go about kind of checking that people are actually following conveyancing protocols in practice. So again, that might be through use of your workflows. It might be task lists. It might be, that you use your file reviews, independent file reviews, to actually use that as a measurement to ensure that you can actually check that the personnel are adhering to the protocols. So that's something new that you need to be aware of. Moving on to 5.12. So this is just a bit of an extract of the AML requirements. So 5.12 is the chunkiest section, the chunkiest requirement in the standard. So this is making sure that you have an anti-money laundering policy that complies with the legislation, and there's lots and lots of sub-requirements. So we have some amendments specifically in relation to investigation, analysis, documentation and recording effectively. So what we have here is 5.12i and 5.12k, which kind of sit side by side really. So we need to have a documented procedure for checking and analysing source of funds and source of wealth. Make sure that everybody's trained so they understand the difference between source of funds and source of wealth. Obtaining evidence of source of funds is getting a bank statement, HSBC, £100,000 in that account. Evidence of source of wealth is how has that £100,000 been accumulated, and what investigations have I as a fee earner made, and and what questions have I asked, how have I analysed this, and that needs to be obtained. So the evidence needs to be obtained, but also that documented analysis needs to be retained on the file as well. So I always liken this to when you were a kid, and the teachers used to say, when you're doing your exam, always show your workings out, because actually, even if you get the answer wrong, you might get a mark for your workings out. And ultimately, that's the kind of analogy that I use, whereby we do need to make sure that from a business owner's perspective, importantly, is if somebody comes along and needs to review that file, whether it's CQS purposes, whether it's the SRA, whether it's the NCA, that actually that file tells a story, and that's where evidence is key. So it's not good enough to have a file where there's a bank statement showing £100,000 in the account. That doesn't tell anybody anything. That doesn't deal with the the thought process of the fee earner, what investigations they've made, what questions they've asked. So this does need to be considered, and make sure that everybody is following that in practice. And as you'll see a little bit later on, that is something that I do see lacking on quite a regular basis. And then we have this requirement for ensuring that we have a documented AML risk assessment on every file. So this is in the legislation, Regulation 28. So you might think, oh yeah, we've got a practice-wide risk assessment, which is Regulation 18. The matter level risk assessment has always been in the legislation, but it's now been pulled into CQS as well. So again, this sits side by side with your documented analysis. So it might be your risk assessment. It will also incorporate some area for that analysis of evidence of source of funds and evidence of source of wealth and the investigations made. That could be documented in the same place, but you do need to make sure that you do have a matter level risk assessment in relation to AML, in addition to that source of funds and source of wealth evidence. Moving on to property and mortgage fraud. So I think Dreambar, we have some slight amendments, but ultimately what you need to be doing is you need to make sure that you have a practice risk assessment that identifies red flags effectively. So, you need to sit down and give, some consideration as to what those red flags look like, so these are the kinds of things that you should be looking for. And this is what we, are potentially being exposed to. So that's your practice level risk assessment. And then you need to go one step further and ensure that you have a documented fraud level risk assessment on every matter. So again, we talked about the AML risk assessment, but we also need to have a fraud risk assessment on each file as well. So always look back at the wording of the standard. It specifically says documented fraud risk assessment on each file. Okay, so you can have your red flags, but then you need something where your fee earner is engaging with the process and actually giving consideration to what does this transaction look like, and if you look through the requirements of the standard, it's not just about when you are acting for the seller, for example. You also need to give consideration to when you're acting for the buyer, and there is a significant risk of a fraudulent seller because of those red flags. So, once you've identified this, what happens? How do you deal with it? Who deals with the file? Where do you record, any changes in risk? So you need to think about the procedures that then happen from that point of there being an identification of risk. So those are updates to the 2019 version on property and mortgage fraud. And then we have some amendments to SDLT. So we've got some greater detail required to be provided to the client. We need to give them information about the meaning of first-time buyer and major interest in a dwelling, rather than just asking them of their first-time buyer without actually setting out to them what that means so that they can make an informed choice. And then we need to make sure that we have a procedure in place for giving the client a clear written SDLT calculation at the outset. And then, of course, we've got the remaining requirements that were in place prior to 2022. Moving on to leasehold transactions. So again, slight variation to the previous requirement. You need to have a policy for how you deal with leasehold transactions. You now need to explain the difference to the client between freehold and leasehold property, set that out to them. And you also now need to make sure that you are giving consideration to key information that's appropriate to the particular lease, and that you are giving that information to the client clearly and in full and in writing. But also you need to give consideration to the lender requirements as well, and ensure that that is being documented and obviously reported to the client and, of course, the lender if there are any reporting requirements identified. Moving on to client care. So we have just some slight amendments. I already touched upon this. So 6.2. This is in the old standard. We had, 6 point, I think it was 4.2, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. Whereas actually now we only have, communicate to the clients in writing at the outset, like the timescales and appropriate levels of service. Everything else is still a minimum expectation. It's just been moved into the guidance notes. So read the two things together, because we still expect to see all of that requirement that we saw previously, which is, who's dealing with the matter, what's their name, what's their status, who's the supervisor, what's their status, etc., etc. So your client care letter shouldn't change. You shouldn't be taking anything out because this format has changed. 6.4, we have amendments to dealing with lenders. So what we have now is we need to set out that the lender is also a client, and in addition to the purchaser being a lay client. And of course, we need to have a procedure to make sure that we are checking Part 2 of the UK Finance Handbook, which I apologise, I probably always call it the Lender's Handbook. It shows my age. So we need to make sure we check Part 2 of the UK Finance Handbook, and we need to make sure that we are recording that on the file that the check has been carried out. So again, within your policy, you need to set out procedure. This is how we're going to do this. And then, of course, you need to make sure that you follow through with that. And of course, technical support here is strongly recommended. so that you've got verification as to when the lender's handbook was checked, and obviously any updates to the lender's handbook are easily checked when you check again before exchange of contracts. So that's a new requirement that you need to ensure that you have in place. The complaints handling procedure, slight variation to the wording within the requirements. You need to make sure that you are telling the clients that you are dealing with that you will deal with complaints promptly, fairly and free of charge. It's a regulatory obligation, falls under the next section here. But also you need to make sure that you're advising the client of their ability to be able to refer to the legal ombudsman, and that they can seek mediation using alternative dispute resolution, and you need to set out what your stance is in relation to that, and ensure that you tell the clients that you will deal with the complaint for free. So those are your regulatory requirements that have now been brought into the complaints handling procedure. Final section, file and case management. We have a completely new requirement, which is to have procedures in place to make sure that we are minimising the risk of avoidable requisitions from HMLR. So these are, things like Tracy with an E in one document, without an E in another document, making sure that that the documents are witnessed correctly and dated, and those silly requisitions that needn't happen in practice. So you need to make sure that you instigate and develop procedures for how you're going to deal with that in practice. And then we also have a new requirement whereby you need to advise the clients that they have the ability to register up to 3 service addresses, and again, just have a think about what works best for you in practice. Personally, I think an update to the questionnaire that's being sent out to the client at the outset is a good way of being able to deal with that. So those are the first set of changes in file and case management, and then the last change is the requirement now to make sure that you have your documented procedures for archiving, for destroying files, and that obviously sits side by side with your data protection policy, and that you actually then obviously make sure that you document it and you follow through and deal with archiving and destruction in the way that it is set out in your policy. So those are the key requirements that are particularly new that you need to think about. The on-site assessments itself did commence in May 2022. They are not being carried out in large numbers as it stands at the moment, but that is something that will pick up pace in due course. Lots of different profile practices being assessed in terms of their size, their nature, their location. So there's no particular type of practice that is being selected for assessment, but it is the Law Society that does make that call. So it is them that will make give the consideration as to when a practice is selected for assessment. There are patterns and trends that are coming out from those on-site assessments. I wear personally a number of different hats. I do a lot of work doing consultancy work with practices to carry out kind of gap analysis or CQS review, and there's similar patterns and trends coming out from the work that I do as a consultant, which I'll run through with you shortly. So there are key areas of focus which I'll kind of just give you the heads up on, so that you can look at those areas to make sure that you are compliant. But just quickly to kind of explain to you about demonstrating compliance. If any of you have come across me before, you will have heard me talk about this, because it is something that I talk about an awful lot. And I talk about a 3-tier process. And if you take nothing away from today, this is what I want you to take away. So my 3-tier process, as I talk about, is having a process in place where you say as you do as you say, and you provide the evidence quite simply. So the say as you do is all your documented policies and procedures. So you should settle everything out in terms of your documentation. The do as you say is actually making sure that everybody follows those in practice. So if you say that you do something a certain way, then make sure that that is actually what happens, and then provide the evidence, which is just as important as the say as you do and do as you say. So it's really, really imperative that you do give consideration to the fact that, you know, these three tiers need to be in place to be able to fully demonstrate compliance. So I'll give you an example. Where we have requirements to ensure that we check the identity of the other side's conveyancer, that is a requirement under the Property and Mortgage Fraud 513. It's also an Lexel requirement. So I see the same areas of non-compliance in Lexel creditor practices. So an example here would be your say as you do is your documented policy that you would set out your stance. So as a firm, this is our stance. We will check the identity of the other side's conveyancer, and we will check A, B, and C. Usually we'll check the Law Society Find a Solicitor website, we might check the SRA information on their website, we might check the firm's website, we might make a telephone call to the firm. So, you know, there are various methods. So CQS is not prescriptive. You decide on a risk-based approach as to how you are going to deal with each particular requirement. So, so you will set out that this is what we do. So that's your say as you do. Then, of course, everybody needs to make sure that they follow it. When we assess or when we audit, we'll usually ask the question of the fee earner, how to check the identity of the other side's conveyancer. And hopefully they'll say, oh, this is what we do. And it will mirror what is actually documented in the policy. And that's key. So you do need to have that alignment between the say as you do and the do as you say. If your documentation says that you do something in a certain way, and then actually you do it in a completely different way, then what you'll find is you would have non-compliances. And a non-compliance would be that you are in breach of your own policy because you've actually said that this is your stance and you're doing it differently. So make sure that you've always got that alignment between say as you do and do as you say. And then, of course, the third element of that is providing the evidence. So that is, we pick the file up and we're able to see evidence that, you know, that check has been made. There's, you know, electronic file, there's, you know, a screenshot on a paper file, there's a printout, you know, of the check of the Law Society website. There's a file note for the firm on this number at this time, spoke to this person. You know, evidence is key. And, you know, the file should tell a story always. That's nothing new. Business owners, you know, you want that file to tell a story, because if you find yourself in a situation at some point further down the line where the fee earner isn't with the practice anymore and actually you're just left with a file, you can't fill in those gaps, you know. So without evidence, ultimately, you know, my own words from an auditor, without the evidence, it didn't happen. And so that is something that you do need to be mindful of. So if you take nothing away from this, say as you do as you say, and provide the evidence. Make sure that you have those three elements in place to be able to demonstrate compliance with CQS. So I just spoke to you briefly about patterns and trends. These are areas of non-compliance which I see on a very regular basis. So just to give you the heads up here, so it is something that you can have a look at. Business continuity plan testing. We quite often see lack of documentation actually setting out how you will test business continuity plan. So there is a requirement to have an annual a procedure for testing the business continuity plan annually. So where the requirement says you must have a procedure, that needs to be documented. So you need to set out on an annual basis, this is how we will test the business continuity plan. And then, of course, we need to make sure that there is evidence of that testing having taken place. Scenario testing is a really good way of being able to do that, because obviously nobody expects you to burn your building down to see if your business continuity plan would work. But, you know, you can sit and have a conversation with lots of people involved and identify, well, you know, what would we do? How would this, you know, how would we continue to run the business? Financial verification procedures, checking the identity, checking bank accounts of other parties, clients, making sure that you've got procedures in place for dealing with the firm's bankers, identifying authorization procedures. Quite often that is missing out of the financial documentation. You know, who does the fee earner get to authorize, you know, paying out funds, and what does that look like, and, you know, who could do that, and where is it recorded, etc., etc. Also consideration of high-risk third countries. So I see lots of practice-wide risk assessments that say that we don't act for clients that live in high-risk third countries, or we don't act for clients that live overseas, but actually you might not necessarily be acting for a client that lives overseas. You might be acting for a client that lives, you know, in England, but their money is coming from a high-risk third country. or whether we're looking at incoming funds or outgoing payments. So that's something that's quite often lacking. Anti-money laundering practice-wide risk assessment, see, a myriad of different risk assessments, but quite often the practice-wide risk assessment hasn't been updated since the LSAG guidance was approved by the Treasury in summer 2022. That should have been a catalyst for updating the risk assessment, making sure that we're giving consideration to real, current risks and trends. Cryptocurrency, obviously Ukraine, Russia conflict, that should all be reflected there. And then matter risk assessments, obviously I've said about the source of funds, source of wealth evidence. That documented analysis is something that's a key area of non-compliance. And also another area of non-compliance, which you see in a lot of practices, particularly small to medium practices, is the requirement for an independent AML audit function, where practices have actually set out that we do not consider ourselves to be of a size and nature where we need that independent AML audit function carried out. Go back to what the SRA have said in their report, the SRA AML thematic review report in October, where they've said that 50% of practices that they visited that set out that stance actually should have had an audit function in place. And actually they did set out in 2020, the first Colgan Copper virtual conference, that that was actually something that unless you're a sole practitioner, they expected to see happening in practice. So so just reconsider that stance. And additionally, if you have not appointed an MLCO, Money Laundering Compliance Officer, go back and review that stance. Property and mortgage fraud policy. See an awful lot of policies that just called mortgage fraud policy that look like they were once upon a time a law society practice note from donkey's years ago. So make sure what you have is relevant, it's up to date, it does reflect Dream Bar and everything that brought about in terms of our knowledge. Those matter risk assessments quite often missing, and evidence of having checked the identity of the other side's conveyancer is something where we see that non-compliance because there's no evidence on the file. Conflict policy, give consideration to, do you act on both sides of the transaction? And if so, set it all out. What does that look like? Who can authorise it? Quite often, we see silent policies that just do not deal with whether you do act. If so, why are you making that decision? And then what steps are you taking to try to reduce the risk of a conflict arising? SDLT procedures, same areas of non-compliance, lack of LTT references, so and if you've not got any references to LTT, then you might not have that same top of mind awareness with your fee earners or whoever's starting off that quote, and then you might just find, like 4 practices that I've come across in the last 7 or 8 months have found that actually you've started off on an SDLT calculation, and it's only when it's gone wrong at the end and you've realised that there's a shortfall because you've applied first time buyer relief for LTT that doesn't exist because you've done an SDLT calculation, but there's quite often the lack of awareness of LTT being in existence that can cause that. So second pair of eyes on the calculation, and that second pair of eyes verifying the SDLT calculation, lack of evidence of recording that second pair of eyes, and also cross-checking the consideration between the SDLT payment out of client account and the consideration in the contract, the transfer and the SDLT return. And if anybody wonders why that procedure is in place, it's 515D. It is intended to be a post-completion, post-payment check. Read Legal Futures from about 10 days ago, whereby a conveyancer was banned from working in law firms, having siphoned off £338,000 worth of SDLT payments because of making amendments to that documentation. So there's very real reasons for why these things are in place. Leasehold procedures, make sure that you explain what's the difference between freehold and leasehold to a client and give full advice. Don't be sending a copy of a lease saying, here's your 47-page lease. Read, understand, make sure you follow the covenants on page 6 under Schedule 4. That's not good enough. Reporting to lenders, those Part 2 checks, making sure that you are recording on the file that that you are making the check and against the lender's requirements. And also, I quite often see policies that are lacking in, if we do need to make a report to the lender, how do we do it? So that was a 2019 requirement, still 2022 requirement. Make sure that you do actually set out, how do you report? What is it you're telling the lender? What does that look like in accordance with the core practice management standard? Lots and lots of closing letters to the client do not refer to HMLR property alert service, and that should be something that you should change, and obviously make sure that you have your documented policy in your closing procedures. So lots of non-compliance there, and obviously we've got that new requirement with avoiding HMLR requisitions that obviously you need to make sure that you've got procedures in place for managing that. I am aware that I'm talking a lot, which is quite often what I do where I'm talking about CQS, but just to bring you on to what is new, and this is something that everybody needs to really take note of. So there are going to be some changes to the application process. So I think the Law Society sent out a general email to the SRO back in October, setting out that there is going to be a new portal and further information will be provided. That information is due imminently, so we all need to keep an eye out for that. Do bear in mind do remind your senior responsible officer that they're the one that gets the emails from the Law Society. The Law Society don't spam. If they're emailing, they are either giving valuable information or they're identifying to you that you've been selected for an on-site assessment. So keep an eye out for those emails. But the next one that should come out should be detailing these changes. So ultimately, obviously, we've all been dealing with this paper application now since CQS was incepted back in 2010. The Law Society has spent an awful lot of time over the last couple of years actually developing this online portal, which will be a whole new system. So there'll be new questions. That previous cycle where you had a reaccreditation application or an interim application, that will be dispensed with. So it will be one form, one question, one set of questions, regardless of where you are in that cycle. So there will be some new questions in there. The way the system will work is that you'll still get your reminders. So you'll get your 3-month reminders and 2 months and 1 month, and however the Law Society set that out to say that this is your expiry date. Make sure that you get your application in by that expiry date. That is really, really important. The way that the system's worked over the last 12, 13 years is, obviously you've dealt with your application, you've posted it off, you've popped it in the DX, or you've emailed it over to the accreditations team, and somebody has eventually picked it up and dealt with it, and might have come back with questions, and that's how it's been dealt with. The way this new system will work is that firms will be given, they will have their expiry date for their current accreditation. They need to make sure that they complete and submit that online portal by their accreditation expiry date. And if not, then there is 2 options. Well, there's 1 option to the client. So firstly, make sure that you comply with that expiry date and get your application submitted. If you're not going to be able to, for whatever reason, there will be the ability to be able to make an application to the Law Society for a one-off 1-month extension, no more. So you won't be able to keep getting extension after extension. So you'll be able to get a 1-month extension. It will be chargeable. The Law Society will be making an admin charge. I think it's about £113, there or thereabouts. And you must ensure that you get your application in completed through the portal by that expiry, whether it's your original expiry or whether you get an extension. And the way the portal will work is where you might have previously sent your application in to say, I'm waiting for my broker for my claims and notification summary, this is to follow. You won't be able to do that with this portal. So if you can imagine what these portals look like these days, you'll have questions, you'll have sections, and you will be able to answer the questions within the sections, and then you will be able to browse and upload the corresponding documents, like your qualified accountant's reports, your claims and notifications, your complaints information, all that kind of thing. So you will need to answer the questions, you will need to upload the corresponding documentation. Only once you have successfully completed a section with the answer to the question and the documentation will that section turn into a tick. And only once you've completed all the sections, and I believe you will be able to move around and jump out and in and save as you go along, so you could do this over a period of time. Only once you've actually been able to complete all the sections, upload all the documentation, will all the ticks be live, and will you then be able to click submit to be able to submit that documentation. So that's going to be a real shift in mindset, and is something that everybody needs to be aware of. And once the Law Society issue more information about that, I'm sure I'll probably be back on here talking to people about it as well. So that's really, really key. So make sure you keep an eye out on your expiry date and the updates from the Law Society. And that portal from the Law Society's perspective will be a lot more useful for them. It will be intelligent. They will be able to extract data automatically. And it might be that that data then will profile practice, and that may then lead to practices being selected for on-site assessment at the time that they do, based on that information that is actually being submitted in the application portal. So that is what's coming next for CQS, and that's something that's going to be it's going to impact, you know, over 3,000 firms. So so keep your eye out for that information. Everybody will, I'm sure, be pleased to know that that is all I've got time for. Probably had less time than that, to be honest with you. So I do apologise for running over, but it's all valuable information, and hopefully has been worthwhile you listening. Thanks very much for listening. I am going to hand you over to Dave Dingle from Osprey, who just quickly wants to talk to you. So over to you, Dave.
Lovely, thank you very much. I won't keep you too long. I've just got a single slide to show. Really, this was just about how Osprey actually supports you with your CQS compliance needs. Obviously, we offer a centralized cloud solution that all your team members have access to, a connected and single source of data input. And this helps you with your streamlined processes and ensures that your data processes and continuity across all of your users is of a quality standard. And then we also support all the security in addition to the information and people management elements. We provide you with the client onboarding tools, of which a number of those are fully integrated with InfoTrack. A client portal for the provision of status updates and the sharing and collaboration of documents and information, as well as the automated workflows. Now, on the topic of CQS, the automated workflows are particularly useful because you're able to incorporate all of those elements of checking, you know, whether people have conducted the relevant actions during the onboarding process. So they're particularly important to ensure that you're complying with CQS. Also, we have our fully integrated accounts. Obviously, it's fundamental that you have accurate financial reporting. And at the back, we've got the real-time reporting in business intelligence. So this helps a practice minimize risk and ensure compliance. So you can run business intelligence and reports on, you know, upcoming client and matters where AML checks are perhaps due to expire within the next 30 days, for example. So all of these elements all come together within the centralized platform. And then if you take that a step further and you look at our integration with InfoTrack, we then actually extend that, that ability to comply with CQS. So just to now pass you over to Lisa, who's now going to be able to take you through how they can help you meet the practice, the management standards. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Tracy. I'm just going to share my screen for everybody. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the session today. I'm going over a few points that Tracy mentioned in slides earlier, and also Dave with how InfoTrack integrates into Osprey as well. I just want to highlight that InfoTrack organically complements the CQS and the CPMS procedures naturally. And that's because when we build new components onto our website, we always have compliance at the forefront of our mind and ease of use as well to make it standard throughout your practice. So you're never far behind in using technology with InfoTrack. That just helps you meet any CQS requirement naturally. And what I've done, because of the changes to the CQS process, or CPMS, should I say, and what I've done to make it easy for you guys, and you do get copies of these slides as well, is just broken down the products and solutions we already have in place within InfoTrack to meet various sections of the CPMS standards. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but by the way, you can actually read the slide yourself. But if we look at section 1, for example, structure and strategy, when you use InfoTrack, it is naturally a firm-wide account. So when you start using InfoTrack, everybody can see what's going on in InfoTrack usage throughout the firm. And particularly when it's integrated with Osprey as well, everything drops into Matter for you. You launch InfoTrack through Osprey, and all of your documentation is digitized straight away and drops straight into Matter. So you've got standardization across all conveyancing services, which is a godsend when it comes to implementing CQS procedures, because obviously you put the procedures in place, the users across the firm need to adhere to them, and by using InfoTrack, you're using a standard system which everybody uses firm-wide, so everybody's trained naturally into using the system that you choose. And financial management as well with InfoTrack. There's some new things, particularly when it's talking about reporting into lenders, and also collating source of funds data too. As Dave mentioned on his slide as well, we have onboarding, digital onboarding solutions on InfoTrack, where if you want, you can do a verification of funds, a VOF search organically, again, information dropping straight into Matter. And naturally as well with InfoTrack, with using all of our services and solutions, it means one invoice for everything as well. So it allows you to keep track on financial management. And if with your Osprey integration, you have the finance integration switched on, of course, everything is going to go onto the ledger to final statements as well. So you're never, ever going to miss a disbursement, including when you are working with indemnity policies as well. So if you've ordered indemnities through InfoTrack, that's going to be on the final statement straight away without any mishap of missing it. So section 3, information management, we have our own GDPR and privacy policies as well. They're there for you to use on the front of our website whenever you wish. And LMS integration is quite nice as well when you are looking at reporting and how you liaise with lenders. We have a unique LMS integration on the InfoTrack system, which allows us to update your LMS portal automatically for priority searches and for AP1 submissions as well. So all of those emails that you receive from LMS now, reminding you to do things, notifying you of fines and so on, they can all disappear because we can actually not only integrate with you via Osprey, but also integrate into your LMS account as well. So we can take that care of that for you. And again, all the information, all the liaison between the LMS portal and yourselves is documented straight into case. People management, a new section in the CPMS, by using InfoTrack, as I mentioned, firm-wide account, but we support all of your users of InfoTrack throughout your journey with us. And that's a complimentary service. You have a dedicated account manager who's there on call all of the time to train your users, educate you with new solutions, and also more importantly, train new users as well. And lots of law firms have InfoTrack sessions built into their induction plan, and we can actually help get across your best practice messages during training as well. So do not hesitate to use us for that type of thing. And then section 5, which Tracy mentioned, is the meatiest section of the CPMS. You can see there we have a lot of products support you there. So when being audited, by using InfoTrack, it naturally ticks the box for recording key dates, for example. Not a lot of people know that this exists, even though they've been using InfoTrack for quite some time, but we do record key conveyancing dates. Naturally, when you use InfoTrack for your priority searches and your AP1 submissions, we will automatically notify you when the OS1 needs refreshing, OS2 needs refreshing, and also we will also notify you straight away of any requisitions from your AP1. And because it's a firm-wide account as well, everybody in the business sees that. So if there is absence, everybody is alerted to the fact that requisitions are outstanding or a priority search needs refreshing. So obviously all the users can do that on behalf of everybody else. SDLT and Lender Handbook. Lender Handbook is a new requirement in the CPMS. You have to document that you are actually checking the Lender Handbook throughout the transaction. And the Lender Handbook in full is actually part of InfoTrack. So you don't have to go onto a separate website to get the notifications or to check the Lender Handbook. It's all built into the system. And you can actually set yourself up for notifications as well. So with any of the banks that you are working with, you can switch on, switch off notifications. So we alert you when things have changed with that particular lender, and we will also document the PDF for you as well, and that drops straight back into the Osprey case. So I'll point that out to you when I just take a quick look around the website in a second, because a lot of people do not realise it's there. So I'll show you where it is. SDLT as well, by doing SDLT submissions through us, we're fully integrated with HMRC, but again, with the pre-population that you benefit from throughout InfoTrack, your SDLT submission for a transaction is 90% complete as soon as you start a matter, because obviously the information you key into Osprey, the results of the searches that come back from us, will automatically give you full population of data on the SDLT. And of course, as well, we do work out the calculation for you. So you can actually rely on us for a secondary calculation or calculator on the CPMS requirements, but we do that for you. And also as well, we do the working out of the SDLT value for you as well. So where codes are needed, first-time buyers and so on and so forth, the document that you create before you submit to SDLT, the land transaction return form, is actually saved, and that will show you your working out once you've actually submitted to the HMRC as well. And again, that's all digitised, all dropped into Osprey. It's there for you. So you don't have to remember to record it, print it off, save it as a file. It's there for life, basically, in your InfoTrack account. Section 6, client care. Electronic client onboarding. This is vastly becoming very, very popular for onboarding clients, because obviously when you do onboard a client, they don't necessarily have the time to drop in, bring in their passport and so on and so forth, or send bank statements and so on. So electronic client onboarding has got really, really popular, where your client can identify themselves digitally with their passport or their driving licence, and also carry out verification of funds checks as well. Built into our ECOS offering is AML as well. So when you onboard a client through InfoTrack, you can opt to include a full AML search as standard. And that's just a one-click process for your client, your consumer to do, but you know that that AML search that's been done is fully compliant to the 5th directive. So no extra checks need to be done by you. So that's built into our ECOS offering. And then file and case management. Of course, the majority of you on here today have either integrated with Osprey or are about to, or if you need more information, I'll give you some contact numbers in a second. But basically, using InfoTrack through case management just makes life a whole lot easier. It's very easy using the website, but more easier when you are using case management as well, because everything you do on that matter, everything you do on that case, and when you use InfoTrack for those services, they drop straight back into Matter for you, and you know that it's updating all of your financials behind there as well, and all the ledgers. So without further ado, I'm just going to flip over to InfoTrack just to highlight where a few of these things are, so you can actually go away and take a look yourselves. So when you log on to InfoTrack through Osprey, it's a slightly different view that you see. That's what's on the screen at the moment. So what I want you to take away from your mind at the minute is the existing orders in the middle. When you launch InfoTrack through Osprey, you are only looking at that matter itself. So you will see that there's only one file available for you to view when you view InfoTrack through Osprey. However, the rest of the screen, so the dashboards over to the left-hand side, the workflow at the top of the screen, and the dashboard over to the right-hand side are static. So that means that everything is firm-wide at that level when working through InfoTrack through Osprey. Now, going over to the right-hand side, the calendar. Now, the calendar is here. As I mentioned about recording key dates in conveyancing, this calendar is there if you use us for land registry searches and for submitting AP1s as well. So literally you can see here that tomorrow I have requisition outstanding, and also an OS priority expiry needs my attention before tomorrow. Scott Bazzini has actually ordered that priority search, but he's on holiday. But as a colleague of his, I can actually go in there and refresh the OS priority straight away with a click of a button. So we notify you when things need addressing, but this calendar isn't just telling you what's going to happen this week, it's historical. So as soon as you start using InfoTrack for those services, you will see that you've got a recorded log, which will go back from the date that you first started using it. So you can show this as evidence as part of your CQS assessment, that you use InfoTrack for recording key dates, and here's a documented evidence. It's on there. Just by opening up InfoTrack, you can actually show that. So over to the left-hand side, we have a number of dashboards, which just makes it easy for you to go to certain areas when you want to see certain areas. So as I mentioned earlier, when you actually submit land registry AP1 submissions through us, we've been digitised since we started launching this product 7 years ago, you will see that you've got an AP1 dashboard. The little toggle on there, which has got a token which says 2, informs me that something needs addressing on the AP1 dashboard. And I can see here that I've got a requisition outstanding here. So again, the AP1 dashboard allows you to record your log of how you actually deal with requisitions, where they are stored, and every time you actually address a requisition on InfoTrack, all of the liaison with the land registry and so on is saved as a separate document, stored on InfoTrack and straight into the Osprey matter as well. So you've got that digital record and that digital log of everything that you need to see on here, basically. Now, when you do have a requisition, if I just go into this one here, and when you do have a requisition, you can answer it directly from InfoTrack. You can upload documents, you can ask for actions and so on and so forth, but you've got a full log of what's been done on that particular AP1. And again, remember, it's a site-wide account, so anybody can get involved in answering requisitions. And this isn't just going into a queue for the land registry to deal with. This goes directly back to the land registry operator who raised the requisition in the first place. So you don't have to pick up the phone, you don't have to hang on the phone for a long, long time when working with the requisitions, when using InfoTrack. You can rely on this chat function to know that everything has gone back to the operator and is being dealt with. And you can see to the bottom right, we've got respond to requisition and request HMLR action as well. So if you just want to basically an extension date, you can actually request an extension of time there, and that will be acknowledged almost straight away. Now, just going back to that workflow at the top of the screen, if I just go back to where we were at the beginning, so you'll see here that onboarding right the way through to post-completion, we support you digitally wherever. So just mentioning ECOS quickly, you can see there that we've decoupled AML from ECOS because maybe you don't want to onboard your client fully digitally because they are happy to come in, show their documentation and so on, yet you still want to do an AML search on them. So you can actually just use AML freestanding. But if you do want to onboard your client electronically fully, you will see that our service allows you to pick and mix how you want to onboard your client, but also covers other areas as well to extend the onboarding process. So you can see here that we can onboard clients for a sale, a purchase, for a commercial private client, or if you just want to verify them online or VOF them online, and I'll talk about that in a second, across the firm, you can do that. But if I just pop back to the sale onboarding, you can see here that verification ID just allows them to video selfie themselves and also take a snapshot of their passport or their driving license. The AML check is automatically built in, so that's a full AML search meeting the 5th directive. And if you want a verification of funds, you can. And that just allows your client to send up to a year's worth of bank statements over to you digitally. If they're an online banker, they will be able to do that for you. And everything, of course, is secure. What we do as well, when you actually use us for verification of funds or VOF, we basically give a truncated report, a synopsis of those bank statements. So we clearly show you top debits, credits, large amounts of money, and so on. So you've got something to refer to quickly to see any anomaly. But we've also digitised forms as well, because lots of our clients obviously say, is there an easier way for our client to get the TA6, TA10 back to us? Yes, there is. When you use us, we've digitised these so your client can fill them fully online and they can't send them back to you until they're fully complete. So all of that time you spend chasing at the minute to actually get that data correct for what you need it for, that all disappears when using us for onboarding. And of course, as you would expect, due to customer feedback, you can also add your own covering documents. So if you want to take the opportunity when you onboard your client electronically to upload your client care letter, your terms and conditions, you can add your documents as well, and they will be electronically signed by your client. And that's all sent to your client via email. They then can actually complete that via the web. So the web journey is available. But if you want to do it for an app, which we brand on your behalf with your brand and colours, you can have that option as well. So if you're not using this for onboarding at the moment, do speak to your account manager or get in touch with me at the end and I can give you a quick demonstration on that in full. As you know, we do searches as well, but where we've complemented searches and taken the commodity out of it really is by bringing you property report. Now, lots of people have started using this. It's been going now for about 1.5 years, but one of the main sort of requests we got from our existing clients over the years is there anything you can do for us on report on title? Can you make it easier? Can you make sure that I'm not cutting, pasting, having 16 screens open? So we built Property Report, which is going down a storm. And we didn't do this just independently neither. We work closely with the Law Society, closely with all the regulatory bodies to make sure that this document protects you from a compliance point of view and risk management point of view as well. So when anything changes, you know that InfoTrack has got your back. Basically, everything will update accordingly. And there has been some recent changes in how you need to report on the guidelines of building regs. Just launched over the last couple of weeks, a new compliance measure has been launched that you have to report on that when doing your report on title. We've automatically built that in for you. So it's future-proof really. As compliance and legislation changes, so will the property report. But basically the property report will allow you to create a report using all of the searches that you've ordered from us, and that will automatically populate a report for you. And you click on order to order the report. Of course, you can do this for freehold, right the way through to unregistered. If it's new build property, if it's cash purchase and so on, we can make sure that the correct report is compiled for you. And you will see here as well, if I just pop in a matter number, you will see here that when you actually order the report, you can report in title on full, or you can actually do that incrementally as well. So we've done the report on title, searches and everything else that you need to work with. But going back to Tracy's slide as well, where there's some new requirements on how you report back on leasehold properties. Of course, if it's a leasehold property, you'd know that we will be including the right clauses for you automatically. Of course, your report can be white labelled as well to your colour scheme and your background of how you want the report to look like. But you will see as I scroll through the report, all of our pre-wording, our library of text to support you and make this easy for your client to read is all done. So all you need to do is to follow the orange triangles really, and just basically entering the information that you need to enter to make this your own. So for here, this is just reminding you, is the seller actually the seller on the actual register? If it's not, if it's acting in a probate case, you just work through the actual report and add the changes that you will need to work with. When I go down to the searches, everything is filled in for me, basically, because we've read the searches, you've ordered the searches through us. So all of that digital information is taken into account. What we actually do is just basically show you certain areas that may need your approval. So when we're talking about planning, for example, we just put the clauses in that's applicable to that property, and you just acknowledge that you want to save that. And of course, you can actually add your own additions here as well. And when you publish, you can publish it incrementally, so you can publish it section by section, or you can actually publish it in full. But you can always go back, edit it, and so on as well. So it's there for you to use. And of course, that drops straight into your Osprey case as well. Now, Tracy mentioned a lot about knowing who your lawyer is and knowing who your client is as well. So you will see in bank check, we have lawyer bank checks. And as I mentioned earlier, we do integrate fully with LMS as well. So when you actually use Lawyer Bank Checker through us, we do use the Confirmly product, which is powered by LMS, and also Lawyer Checker as well, should you want to use that. And right the way through to SDLT and AP1, as I mentioned earlier, when you start using InfoTrack on a matter, this automatically starts to populate. So by the time you come to finish this off, it's 90% complete, and you will be able to do all calculations through us as well with a record of that working out. So that's a whiz around InfoTrack. I don't think I've missed anything from this synopsis and what I mentioned earlier, but let me just finish by just nipping back to my slides and just something that the Law Society sent me. Actually, we do a lot of work with the Law Society and keeping up to speed with everything that's going around, but they have actually issued a guidance note by stating that digital records of your documentation is not a necessity, it's not mandatory. However, it does become more encouraged as time goes on, because there's so much that you need to report back on. It's quite logical to do this digitally. So of course, by using InfoTrack through Osprey, you know that everything is safe, everything's in the same place, and everything's doing the same thing as well. And it's easier to gather that documentation when you are working with the CQS assessors as well. So just a quick synopsis of who I am. I'm Lisa, and that was Tracy as well. Sorry, Dave, I haven't got a photograph of you, so your name and your contact details are not on this slide. But everybody, if you've got a question for Dave, or you want me to ask him to get into touch with you, there's my email address. Likewise with Tracy, just get in touch if you need more information. So without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Faye just to finish off. Thank you very much, everyone.
Lovely. Thanks ever so much, Lisa. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Dave. I hope everybody else has found this really interesting. We have just had one question through on the Q&A, and it's for Tracy. So if anybody does want to raise another question, now's your time to get one in before we close the webinar and wrap things up for today. But the question is, Tracy, do you have any precedent policies or procedures available?
Okay, so I personally tend to do more on a one-to-one with clients where they want more of a bespoke service. So there are precedent and template policies and procedures available. So the Law Society do have a CQS toolkit. The current CQS toolkit, I will say, is out of date. So I think it dates back to probably about 2019. And they are in the process of updating that, though. So I think in spring there is likely to be an update to that. So obviously it covers off the 2022 version of the core practice management standard. But what I will say to practices where they are using templates, precedents, wherever they get them from, whether it's from a compliance company or whether it's from the Law Society, is that they are just that. They are a template, and it needs to be very much a starting point, because quite often what you will find is that the template policy has a lot of information in it, and that might not necessarily represent what you're actually doing in your practice. And where I do see practices that will obtain template policies and procedures is that, they will quite often say, well, there's our documented policies and procedures, but actually what happens in practice is different. So therefore, they're actually potentially setting themselves up there for being in breach of their own policy. So they really are a starting point to just kind of open up the floor to let's adapt these and make sure that they are actually what we do in practice.
Okay, that's lovely. Thanks so much, Tracy. Okay, so I think that's all we've got time for today. So I'd like to say a huge big thank you to Tracy Thompson from Tracy Thompson Associates for joining us today, and also to Dave Dingle from Osprey and to Lisa Edwards from InfoTrack. I hope everybody that's joined this webinar today has found it helpful and informative. As Lisa mentioned, if you do have any other questions about anything you've learned today or about CQS itself or the technology available to support your compliance journey, then please do contact us, either using the details on your screen right now. As Lisa mentioned, she'll be happy to put you in touch with Tracy or Dave should you need them, or else reach out to your account manager, who will be more than happy to assist you. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, this webinar is being recorded and we'll send you a copy so that you can refer back to it in the next day or so. So all that's left to say is thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to Lisa, Tracy and Dave, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.